how do you plan a subway system for a metro area as vast and dispersed as that of Los Angeles? For planners, that meant starting here, on Wilshire Boulevard. This was the densest part of LA, a natural starting point for a subway system. But take a look at LA's sprawling metro system today, and you'll see that this very line barely runs a few stops down Wilshire before abruptly ending. This was a line envisioned decades ago as the backbone line of LA's transit system. Even as the rest of the system has grown dramatically, why is this line still unfinished? By the 1960s, LA had fully dismantled what used to be the world's largest urban rail network, and a region once crisscrossed by streetcars became dominated by highways. But the consequences of LA's new car-oriented lifestyle would soon become apparent, as LA's air quality turned hazardous, and daily commutes started to look like this. For many, a rail system was an obvious solution, and while LA once had an extensive network of streetcars, it never had a true rapid transit system like you'd find in New York or Chicago. Systems in those cities have fast, high-capacity trains that always run in a dedicated space separate from other traffic, often underground or elevated. Unlike streetcars, which got stuck in the same traffic as cars, rapid transit could provide a true alternative to driving. But financial constraints always prevented LA's attempts at building such a system, going back more than a century. What's worse, post-World War II, the private funding that built most of America's transit in the early 1900s had all but dried up. Local governments barely had money to operate whatever was left of their transit. They certainly didn't have the millions of dollars needed to build anything new. But as transit systems began shutting down and cutting operations across the country, the federal government finally stepped in, offering an 80% match in funds for urban transportation projects. By the 60s and 70s, cities across America were building out brand new rapid transit systems. After numerous failed starts spanning decades, this could finally be LA's moment. And in 1973, LA Mayor Tom Bradley jumps on this possibility, promising to break ground on a rapid transit system within his first 18 months in office. But that's a nearly impossible promise to fulfill because it means the entire LA region, comprising more than 80 cities, needs to agree on a single plan for what a system should look like. The Southern California Rapid Transit District, or RTD, already had its rapid transit plan rejected by voters 5 years earlier. Bradley realizes that LA is just too big, with too many stakeholders for everyone to agree on an entire system at once. So he scales back to building a single line that would form the backbone of any LA transit system, a starter line down Wilshire Boulevard. But while a Wilshire line was consistent across nearly every previous LA transit plan, it would have to look a little different here. Because the starter line carried no guarantees of any future lines, this line was the only chance for all of LA's political interests to make their mark. For Tom Bradley, that meant satisfying an important political base, LA's suburban San Fernando Valley. Unable to promise a future line to them, he instead pushes to reroute the Wilshire line so Valley voters have a stake in the system. But RTD's preferred route to connect to the Valley, going north under the Sepulveda Pass near Santa Monica, didn't please officials in Hollywood. They wanted Hollywood to have a station, and threatened to pull support for the starter line if they didn't get one. And that left the only other option to connect to the Valley, the Cahuenga Pass near Hollywood, cutting the line's time on Wilshire short at Fairfax Avenue. By this point, the starter line had become unrecognizable from what it was initially designed to be, a line that reflected LA's messy politics rather than sound transportation design. But in trying to satisfy Hollywood, planners would now invite the project's greatest opposition yet. Residents of the Fairfax district aren't happy with the subway running through their neighborhood. Right behind them is the US Representative Henry Waxman, who represents much of LA's wealthy West Side region. For now, Waxman has merely expressed doubts about the subway project. But then, disaster struck. Methane gas from one of LA's many methane gas zones causes an explosion at a Ross Dress for Less in the Fairfax district. The incident has nothing to do with the subway project, but Waxman uses it to claim that the area is too unsafe for subway tunneling, even with experts arguing that tunneling could still be completed safely. At this point, the political climate surrounding the starter line is increasingly hostile. Ronald Reagan is now president and takes a hard line against urban transportation projects, specifically targeting the LA project in his speeches. Cities had previously gotten entire systems federally funded in one go. Now LA was having to fight for funding for a single line. Without Waxman's support, the starter line couldn't get anywhere. But this project was LA's best chance ever at getting a rapid transit system, and supporters of the project have one last-ditch attempt to save it. The subway would avoid Waxman's district entirely. Instead of going north on Fairfax, the subway would go up Vermont Avenue. To the west, the line would veer south into Mid-City. And with these changes, Waxman allows funding for the line to go through. For now, though, the line would end at Wilshire Boulevard and Western Avenue in Koreatown, leaving a small stub line on Wilshire stopping short of Waxman's district. Numerous extensions, including the one through Mid-City, were planned as future projects. And against all odds, the starter line was built. Its first phase opening in 1993 as the Metro Red Line. All the planning and political bargaining had finally produced LA's first modern subway line. But the numerous planned extensions of the Red Line would never happen. Cost overruns and construction mishaps, culminating in a sinkhole opening up at the Red Line's construction site in Hollywood, turned public sentiment against the project. Sensing an opportunity, LA County Supervisor and subway opponent Zev Yaroslavsky authors a ballot measure to prevent LA from using county taxes on subway tunneling. And voters approve it. LA had just built out its first subway line, but for the foreseeable future, it would also be its last. For the next 2 decades, LA built out new rail lines with light rail, and to save on costs, built much of it running at street level, where trains are often forced to wait at traffic lights. With this, many of the corridors that would have used fast, high-capacity heavy rail were stuck with slow, low-capacity trains with little room to absorb future ridership. Higher density areas that required underground tunneling or the high capacity of heavy rail were left unserved entirely. But the same problems that spurred planning of an LA rapid transit system decades ago were only getting worse. So bad, in fact, that Waxman and Yaroslavsky eventually became enthusiastic supporters of a subway down Wilshire Boulevard, with the then mayor Anthony Villaraigosa running on a promise to finally build a subway line down Wilshire. The wind was finally in Metro's sails. In 2014, Metro broke ground on the Purple Line extension, extending the small Wilshire branch of the Red Line into a full line across Wilshire. Its first phase is scheduled to open in 2025, almost 30 years after it would have been built if not for Waxman's opposition. Decades of missed opportunity for the millions in LA because of the opposition of a handful of people. And where there was Waxman for LA, there was Reagan for the country. LA's subway system remains the last new heavy rail system built in the continental US, largely because it was built just as Reagan cut federal funding for transit projects. America's political shift to the right would reduce political appetite for expensive heavy rail construction, turning the rest of America towards light rail, just as local politics forced Metro to do the same. Planners never meant LA's system to look like this, but as always, it was politicians that had their way.